So immediately the brethren send away Paul to go as if it were by sea, but Silas and Timotheus abode there still. So Paul leaves. They brought Paul down to Athens in southern Greece, and he, receiving a commandment unto Silas and Timotheus for to come to him with all speed, they departed. So now here's Paul all alone in Athens, waiting for his companions to show up. And we get this amazing story starting in verse 16. While he was waiting, his spirit was stirred in him when he saw the city wholly given to idolatry. So if you've seen pictures of, if you've ever visited Athens, the Parthenon up on the hill, and below that you have the Areopagus or Mars Hill, it is a city that was completely devoted to the worship of the pantheon of the Greek gods and goddesses that we've mentioned before, that the Romans have now changed to Latin names, but here we are in Greece. This is where it all started. Athens is the epicenter for this pagan worship of this particular pantheon of gods and goddesses.
So the Parthenon is from the Greek word parthenos, which means the virgin, and it was dedicated to Athena, who was the chief or patron god for the city of Athens. But there are many other gods there, and Paul is just like, this world has just become completely confused with all these disparate worldviews and worship of all these different gods and goddesses. And so he tries to insert himself to teach the truth.
So verse 17, here we go. He disputed in the synagogue with the Jews and with the devout persons, and in the market daily with them that met with him. Then certain philosophers of the Epicureans and of the Stoics encountered him, and some said, "What will this babbler say?" So these are men who like to gather in the agora, or the agora, the forum, or up on Mars Hill, and they love to just sit around and talk about ideas, because it's all about what you know, gnosis. It's a big deal to these ancient Greeks. It's rooted clear back into Plato and Aristotle, and before them, Socrates. This expanding of the mind. So they're all sitting there discussing ideas.
And Athens was essentially a college town, actually one of the greatest university towns in the ancient world. So people were not afraid to hear new ideas necessarily, and it was expected that people would be generating or listening to new ideas. But of course, it would always be a pretty heavy debate about whether people would agree with this new idea or not. And we see that these philosophers, these educated people, are already judging that they don't think Paul has anything of substance or of truth that they should be truly listening to.
And it's described beautifully in that middle part of verse 18 when it says that their thought was, Paul, seemeth to be a setter forth of strange gods. So we're going to listen to him. This is going to be good entertainment, right? Because he preached unto them Jesus and the resurrection. So they took him and they brought him unto Areopagus, which in translation is just Mars Hill. And they said, "May we know what this new doctrine whereof thou speakest is?" And so he begins in verse 22, Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill, and he said unto them, "Ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things ye are too superstitious." The Greek word there, you see in your footnote, most religious. You're very zealous for your worship. "For as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, To the Unknown God." Here's this idea of, on Mars Hill, you would have all these altars and all of these idols, with the idea being that Taylor mentioned before, each god or goddess has a jurisdiction over some part of your life or part of nature, or a patron god or goddess for your city, in this case, Athena. So she gets the big temple up on the hill. You get this idea that if you sacrifice and you please that god or goddess, their spirit can come down and occupy that idol you've made for him or her and grant you all these blessings. But you have to sacrifice, you have to please them. But what if we missed one? What if we left somebody out? We don't want some god up on the Mount Olympus to feel angry because we didn't sacrifice to him. So they set up an altar to the unknown God. And this actually is not unique to Mars Hill. When one time we were over in Rome on a little trip with some of my colleagues, and Lincoln Blumel, he found an altar with an inscription in Latin that was to an unknown God. And that one's in Rome.
I actually have heard of people today in certain countries who have adopted the practices of multiple religions, and their reasoning is, well, we just want to make sure we've covered all of our bases, because if we do this religion, but they're not right, and we do this religion and they're not right, but we do this religion and this one's right, well, then we want to make sure we really are saved. And so we're going to kind of do everything. And Paul's preaching, actually, there's a very simple, single choice that covers all the options, and it's Jesus. But this is such a massive mind shift change for many of these people to say, what, just one single God and none of these other ones exist? They just don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, they're struggling so.
And it's too disruptive, not only to their thinking and worldview, but also to their economy. There's a lot of challenges for why many of the people in the ancient world struggled to initially want to adopt Christianity.
So you get him preaching Jesus Christ as the unknown God to them, because there's no idol and there's no altar to the Savior on Mars Hill. So he then starts in verse 24, God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands. If you look at the Greek word there in Strong's Concordance or a Greek lexicon, you'll see that he's not talking about the big, huge temple structure, the Hieron. He's talking about these shrines or these idols that these people have built. The word is naos. He doesn't dwell in these idols that you've made with hands, these shrines. Neither is he worshipped with men's hands, as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all things. And then he does something interesting. If you go over to this next page, verse 28, for in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. Now, Paul is quoting Greek poets to prove his point here. So can you see this idea in this Greek poet saying, we're the offspring of God, and now here's Paul standing on Mars Hill, pointing to all of these idols saying, are you the offspring? Did any of them give life to you? Do you claim them as your parent in any way, shape, or form? And so he's trying to use Greek philosophy and Greek argumentation to prove a point. You'll notice this isn't going to work very well. And so in his future missionary labors and letters, he abandons trying to philosophize with them or trying to use their own writings and their own poets to prove his point. And he stays with teaching the gospel of Jesus Christ more directly.
It'd be like me today trying to use physics or just philosophy all on its own to convince people about Jesus without ever appealing to the revelations that we have that directly teach about him. And so I think Paul learns from his experience. We did hear early, at one point in his letters, he says, I'm a Greek to the Greek, a Jew to the Jews. He tries to meet people on their cultural ground and communicate with them in a way that makes sense. But I think, as you point out, he realizes, I need to be teaching more clearly and purely from the doctrines instead of trying to do it indirectly through people's culture where they might actually not fully understand the message of who Jesus is.
So we get to the end of his speech here, and he says in verse 31, because God hath appointed a day in the which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained, that's Jesus, whereof he hath given assurance unto all men, in that he hath raised him from the dead. Now at that point, here you are in the capital city of pagan worship, Athens, and the capital city where Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle have done their work 400 years ago, and it's just spread into the whole Mediterranean region from there. And one of the doctrines that they do not believe in is resurrection, and that's what Paul is now preaching a God who came down and died, and his Father raised him from the dead. This is a tough pill for these pagan worshipers to follow.
And what
to
we
swallow.
hear in one of Paul's later letters, foolishness to the Greeks. To them, it's like, that's foolish thought. What religious person would want to worship somebody who's dead?
So notice the reaction, verse 32. When they had heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, and others said, "Oh, we will hear thee again on this matter." We want to hear more. They tend to like these kinds of debate. It's probably entertaining to them. So Paul departed from among them, and it says, "Howbeit certain men clave unto him and believed, among them which was Dionysius, the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them." So he does gain a few disciples for the cause of Christ in Athens, but largely he's rejected. And in chapter 18, he left Athens and came down to Corinth. And there's where he stays with Aquila and Priscilla.